Welcome to episode 156 of Real Health Radio. You can find the show notes and the links talked about as part of this episode at www.7, so the word seven health.com/156.
Welcome to Real Health Radio. Health advice that's more than just about how you look. And here's your host, Chris Sandel.
Hey everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Real Health Radio. So this week I'm doing a solo episode with the topic being understanding carbohydrates. And this was a podcast that I originally recorded more than 3 years ago. But rather than simply putting it out as a rebroadcast episode, I'm re-recording it and updating the content. So like when a book has a second edition, this is my second edition. And I mentioned this on my recent Life Update podcast, that I was planning on doing this on a number of podcast episodes and that I've been planning on doing it for a while. So the solo episodes for the next little while will be me really taking another look at some of the episodes I recorded back in the early days of the show. I'd say for this one, about 50% of the podcast is either new material or sections that have been heavily edited. At points where I've added in new chunks of content or I've removed chunks of content, I'll make reference to this and explain why I've done it. If it's simply me adding in or removing a single thought or a single line, then it will just happen without me mentioning it. And it's funny when I look back on this podcast, because in the world of nutrition, fads seem to come and go pretty quickly. And 3 years can feel like a really long time when you look at what the popular diet books were sort of then versus now. But what has really struck me is how much of the fear of carbohydrates really hasn't shifted. And potentially it's intensified. The keto diet has gained popularity, which is an incredibly low carbohydrate diet. Rather insanely, the carnivore diet has grown in popularity, which is where people are eating nothing but meat. And so very, very, very low carbohydrates. And then in other circles, while carbohydrates aren't completely banned, they're just suggested to be on the lower side. So paleo, while not exclusively low carb, is fairly predominantly low carb. So while 3 years has passed since my first take on this, the anti-carb landscape hasn't seemed to improve much. And potentially, as I said, intensified. So my hope, therefore, with this episode is that it brings some sanity and some balance to the topic. Carbohydrates aren't the fear food that they're made out to be, and they have a huge number of benefits for the body. So what I want to do as part of the show is talk about carbohydrate digestion and metabolism and structure, what carbohydrates are used for within the body, what are the different dietary sources of carbohydrates, what could be your preferences, or how could you think about discovering what are your better forms of carbohydrates. And so let's start with this section on like structure and digestion and metabolism. And this wasn't in the original episode. So after doing that episode on carbohydrates, I also did solo shows on protein and solo episodes on dietary fat. And in those episodes, I included information about digestion and metabolism. So I wanted to update this one so it includes it. So starting with structure. So a carbohydrate molecule is made up of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And in biochemistry, a carbohydrate is known as a saccharide. And saccharides can be broken down into four main categories. So monosaccharide, mono meaning one. These are simple sugar molecules, so things like fructose or glucose. Then you have disaccharide, so di meaning two. And again, these are fairly simple sugars, but where there are two molecules that are connected together. So for example, this would be sucrose, where you have a molecule of fructose and a molecule of glucose that are connected together, or lactose, where you have glucose, which is connected to galactose. The next option is oligosaccharides, and oligo meaning a few. So this is where you have between 3 and 9 sugars that are connected together. And most of the oligosaccharides are substances that are found in the fiber tissues of plants. And they're substances that we're actually not great at digesting, but provide food for the bacteria in our digestive tract to feed off. So if you've heard of things like fructooligosaccharides or FOS, or galacto-oligosaccharides, so GOS, they fall into this category. And they are found in foods like Jerusalem artichoke, burdock, chicory, leeks, soybeans, onions, asparagus, lots of other foods. And they are why these foods are sometimes referred to as prebiotics. So not probiotics, which actually contain bacteria, but prebiotics because they feed the bacteria in your gut. And then the final category in saccharides is polysaccharide. So poly meaning many. So this is when there are 10 or more saccharides connected together. And this category includes starches. So one of the forms of carbohydrates that is found heavily in foods like potatoes and wheat and corn and rice. And it also includes non-starches, which is things like cellulose and pectins. And these are substances that make up the cell walls in plants, which again, as humans, we're not very good at digesting, but still have a role to play in digestive health. So when people talk about the importance of fiber in a healthy diet, this is what fiber is made up of, these non-starchy polysaccharides. So those are the different categories. And with different categories, they don't always neatly fall into just one category. So most foods will have a combination of these different types of saccharides. So for example, a potato, which is often labeled as a starch. Yes, it does contain starch, but it also contains some monosaccharides, it contains some oligosaccharides, and it also contains some non-starch polysaccharides. So the category of food is often labeled as belonging to is more down to which it has the most of, not what it just exclusively has. So now I've covered the basic structure of carbohydrates. Let's look at digestion. And with digestion generally, there are two sides to it. So one is mechanical, which is where the food is crushed and pulverized. So in the mouth with chewing, or in the stomach with the muscles contracting and kind of mushing up the food. And then the other side of it is chemical digestion. And this is where various chemicals or enzymes interact with the food to break down the chemical bonds so the food can be reduced to single molecule form. And in terms of carbohydrates, single saccharide molecules. And so there are a number of places that this digestion happens. So first is the mouth. Saliva contains a substance called amylase, and this is an enzyme that breaks down polysaccharides. And not much breaking down happens in the mouth, but it is a starting place. And it also appears that the mouth is useful as a point of signaling. So the amount of amylase that appears in saliva is based on the body recognizing that in the mouth you're eating carbohydrates or starches. And this then signals to the pancreas to produce more amylase. So when the food eventually reaches the small intestine, it will then be released in the right quantity to deal with that meal. And interestingly, genetics can have an impact on an individual's level of amylase production. And this genetics can be connected to what your ancestors ate. So if your genetics come from a population that ate lots of grains or potatoes, then you're more likely to produce more amylase. If your genetics are from a population that ate more simple sugars, say higher amounts of fruit or honey, then you'll produce less amylase because this enzyme was less important to survival. So I'm not suggesting that you go out and get your genetic testing done, and nor do I think if you produce less amylase that you have to eat a low-starch diet. But this could have an impact on how well you feel eating certain foods and whether you feel better or worse eating certain foods in higher amounts. But sort of back to digestion. Once the food moves from the mouth, it hits the stomach. The acidic nature of the stomach actually stops the actions of the salivary amylase. So the carbohydrate digestion happening in the stomach is more the mechanical digestion rather than the chemical digestion. from the stomach, we move the food or moves into the small intestine. And this is really where most of the carbohydrate digestion takes place. It's where the pancreatic amylase that I mentioned before meets the food and starts breaking down the polysaccharides, so those long chains of sugars. There is also other enzymes to break down the disaccharides into monosaccharides, so the two molecules into one. And these enzymes are things like lactase and sucrase and maltase, which then break down lactose and sucrose and maltose. And it's when these sugars then get into that single sugar form that they then enter out of the small intestine into the bloodstream and then are transported around the body to wherever they're needed. But not all of the saccharides are able to be broken down into those single molecules, which is typically the different types of fibers. So some of this is then turned into short chain fatty acids. So these are things that are helpful for the body. They're things that the bacteria can then feed on. And this will take place in the large intestine or the colon. And then some of the fiber just will remain and it isn't able to be broken down. And then this is passed out the body and it provides a lot of the bulk for the stool. So that's the digestion side of things. Let me then briefly cover carbohydrate metabolism. And what I mean by carbohydrate metabolism is how does the body take these single sugar molecules and then convert them into something useful within the body. And in the case of carbohydrates, this usefulness is normally about providing energy. And I will just be doing this section very, very briefly. Like the metabolism part is very detailed and a complex topic, something that could literally take hours to go through with the referencing of countless steps and different enzymes and reactions. And given the general audience of this podcast and what I'm trying to do with this episode, it's just not worth it. So I'm going to keep this very brief and short. So there are three main areas or parts of carbohydrate metabolism that I'm going to make reference to. And the goal of these areas is to create energy. And this energy is known as adenosine triphosphate or ATP. And this is what the body is trying to produce because ATP is really the currency of the body that it uses for energy. And I am simplifying things here, but ATP is typically what the body is trying to produce from an energy standpoint. So the first stage of metabolism or carbohydrate metabolism is known as glycolysis. And this stage does produce some ATP. It creates two molecules of ATP for every molecule of glucose. But the other goal of glycolysis is to produce a substance called pyruvate. And it's this pyruvate that is then key to the second stage, which is known as the citric acid cycle or the Krebs cycle. And during this citric acid cycle, the pyruvate goes through many changes and reactions, and these reactions lead to the production of ATP, another two molecules of ATP. But most importantly, from an energy production perspective, it leads to the creation of two substances. One is NADH and the other is FADH2. And it's really from these two substances that the real amount of ATP is produced. And it's the NADH and the FADH2 that are used as part of the third stage. And this is known as the electron transport chain or oxidative phosphorylation. Gosh, I'm pronouncing that incorrectly. This is where that NADH and the FADH2 are oxidized to produce ATP. And so while like glycolysis and the citric acid cycle make two molecules of ATP, the electron transport chain makes 32 molecules of ATP. And so that is what I wanted to just talk about in terms of carbohydrate metabolism. That is the level of detail I'm going to go into. If all of that made absolutely no sense to you, don't worry about it. It's not that important. One thing I do just want to mention though is when you eat carbohydrates, not all of it is used for energy immediately. So the body does use some of it, and then some of it is converted into a substance called glycogen. So the body can't store glucose as glucose. It has to convert it into this substance called glycogen. And glycogen is stored in the muscles. It's also stored in the liver. The glycogen in your muscles is pretty much used just for your muscles, and the glycogen in your liver is used for everywhere else in the body, with often like the brain and the nervous system using the most. And so when you run out of your last meal that you just ate, or when you find yourself in emergency situation where you have to flee from a lion, or there's this big stress, and you then need more energy, your body is able to use glycogen. And the way that this happens is you release adrenaline. Adrenaline then causes the release of a hormone called glucagon from the pancreas, and the glucagon then converts the glycogen back into glucose. And so this glucose can then go through all of those different stages that I just talked about to turn it then into ATP. So we have this system where we can store carbohydrates as a substance called glycogen to call on as and when we need it. And so that is all I'm going to mention on that carbohydrate metabolism front. And the reason I did mention it, despite it being fairly technical, is really to hammer home the importance of carbohydrates from the perspective of producing energy, because that really is its main role. So let me go through the various functions that carbohydrates play in the body. Like obviously, as I've just mentioned, first and foremost, carbohydrates are all about energy. And this is energy so that you can run and think, but also energy to run all your various systems and organs. Carbohydrates in most cases are the body's preferred energy source. And I say in most cases because different organs and systems use different energy sources and have different preferences. So for example, the heart has a preference for free fatty acids and uses this as its energy source rather than glucose. The intensity of what you are doing can also dictate energy preferences. So for example, during times of rest, so when you're sleeping, fat is often used as a preference over carbohydrates, or you'll use fat more than carbohydrates. During times of intense exercise, glucose is going to be the main fuel source. And then during normal living, the body uses a combination of both fat and carbohydrates as energy. And despite the ability to use both fats and carbohydrates, there are areas that really do prefer carbohydrates. And I imagine that there will be low carb advocates who disagree with this and tell me all the reasons I'm wrong. But the areas that in particular need glucose are for your central nervous system, for the kidneys, for the brain, for the eyes, things like the cornea and the lens and the retina. Some cells, so the red blood cells, for example, are only able to produce cellular energy from glucose. Personally, I would extend this list to basically all systems and organs, but these are the ones where carbohydrates are of greater importance. And for example, some systems don't need carbohydrates exclusively, but they seem to need an adequate level. And what is considered adequate will depend on the individual and the demands in their life. So I work a lot with women who have lost their periods, so a condition known as hypothalamic amenorrhea. And this is normally driven by overtraining and underfueling. But interestingly, this is more likely to happen when they are restricting carbohydrates or when they are restricting fat. So if they are low carb, it's not just about getting their calories up, it's also about increasing the carbohydrate intake. If they are low in fat, it's not about just getting the calories up, it's about getting in adequate amounts of fat. So even though certain systems and organs don't work exclusively off one fuel source, like when one of them is restricted, it can have a negative impact. And while I've used reproductive health as an example here, I'd say that this is fairly body-wide. And I just want to address something that I didn't mention in the original podcast. And this came up because when I uploaded the original podcast to YouTube, I had a comment. And the comment said, "There are zero requirements for carbs. Your podcast is dangerous with bad info." And that was it for the comment. So I don't have any more information of the reason for someone saying this. But if I was to hazard a guess, it has to do with the word essential that is used in nutrition and the misunderstanding of what this really means. So in nutrition, we talk about essential amino acids. There are 9 amino acids that fall into this category. We talk about essential fatty acids, and there are 2 of these. But there isn't an essential carbohydrate. And this is what I believe this person was trying to get at. But it's not quite so simple. And when talking about nutrition, the word essential simply means that the body isn't able to synthesize this substance itself. If it doesn't come in through the diet, then the body can't make it. And this is different to how we normally think of the word essential. Like normally, essential means the most important. Therefore, things that are non-essential are less important. But from a physiology perspective, just because something isn't essential doesn't make it any less important. And actually, it often points to it being more important. And I'd say that is the case with carbohydrates. Carbohydrates, and more specifically like simple sugars, break down to things like glucose, and they are so important for health that the body doesn't want to leave it to chance that these are going to come in through the diet. So it has mechanisms in place that if inadequate amounts of carbohydrates are coming in through the diet, it can then convert protein or it can convert fat into glucose. So the fact that there aren't any essential carbohydrates doesn't prove that it's unimportant. I would say more the other way around. And this doesn't mean that everyone has to eat a high carbohydrate diet. Like some people will do better on having lower amounts, some people will do better on having more. But to say that as humans we have zero need for carbohydrates is a real misunderstanding of physiology. And the same line of thinking would apply to fats. If the only fats that you ate were linoleic acid and alpha-linolenic acid, which are the 2 essential fats, then good health is not going to ensue. Like the body has incredibly important functions that are dependent on other types of fat. And so even in theory, if the body can make all of these other types, it's unlikely it's going to be able to do them in the quantities that are needed if you're restricting yourself just to the essential fats. And the same with protein, like forcing the body to have to make lots of different amino acids because you're restricting your diets to just the essential ones is putting a burden on the body that could very easily be removed simply by diversifying the diet. So too often it really does feel like people are trying to give the body the bare bones minimum to get by. And when instead they really should be giving it an abundance of really good quality calories and nutrients and food to make this job as easy as possible. And to best support the body, for me, this means including carbohydrates. I'd also mention that the people who make these claims often point towards the extremes examples to make their case. So they say, I don't know, the Inuit ate a high-fat, low-carb diet, and if they can do it, then it proves that anyone can do it and that it is healthy. And the problem with this argument is there's a number of problems with this argument. One of them is the Inuit ate what it was available to them at the time. Like if they were surrounded by oranges and mangoes and potatoes, they would have eaten them. In addition, because these foods weren't available and because the diet they are eating was somewhat restrictive, this then leads to changes in their genetics. So generation on generation of eating this way led to changes in gene expression that meant they were able to make the most of what was on offer, which is very different from someone who doesn't have those genetics. And finally, like what is often talked about as the Inuit diet or whatever tribe is being studied often pales in comparison to what they actually eat. Like their diets are often much more diverse than is talked about. So even people living in these remote regions like the Inuit didn't just eat whale blubber or didn't just eat the 2 or 3 foods that people often talk about. So I know this is kind of a tangent, but I do really think people shape the narrative to match their beliefs. So anyway, back to carbohydrates and its functions. So the brain is highly sensitive to low blood sugar levels because it really only uses glucose to function unless under extreme starvation conditions. And under starvation conditions, the body starts to use ketones in place of glucose. which is what the ketogenic diet is all about, like getting the body to create ketones. So glucose is also converted into ribose and deoxyribose, which are essential building blocks for macromolecules like RNA and DNA. Glucose is additionally utilized to make the molecule NADPH, which is important for the protection against oxidative stress, and it's used for lots of chemical reactions in the body. If you compare the ATP production from carbohydrates versus ATP production from fat or protein, carbohydrates actually yields a much higher amount of carbon dioxide. And this is important because while most people think of carbon dioxide as this waste product that you breathe out, it's not. Like, it's needed for many different functions. So as part of proper cell functioning, it helps to balance electrolytes, it's anti-inflammatory, it inhibits stress, it supports the immune system and liver function. Chris Sandel pointed this out to me, and this is new to this podcast, is carbon dioxide is important for many of the vitamin K functions. So functions like blood clotting, for preventing soft tissue calcification, for helping the mineralization of bones and teeth, and for energy utilization and hormonal health. It's also needed for many of the actions of biotin. Importantly, carbon dioxide also helps your cells to take up and use oxygen. So it's actually the carbon dioxide that allows for the exchange of oxygen. So without adequate carbon dioxide, adequate oxygen can't get into the cells, because cells breathe in oxygen and out carbon dioxide just like we do. So increasing cellular carbon dioxide production, which carbohydrates helps with, is important for proper health. Carbohydrates are also important for intestinal health and waste elimination, so something I've already mentioned. So it does this by providing different types of fiber. Some of this fiber is indigestible, but helps to provide the bulk to our digestive tract, helping with transit through the system and adding bulk to the stools to be fast in the body. Other types of fiber is largely undigestible to us, but provides a good source of food and energy for our gut bacteria. So this is like the prebiotic foods that I talked about earlier, which help to proliferate the beneficial bacteria in our colon. Carbohydrates are also protein sparing and can help with muscle creation. So protein can be used for many things in the body. If it has to, it can be used as an energy source, but really its ability is best used in other ways, like by providing adequate carbohydrates. Protein can then be spared from being used as an energy source, and therefore can be used for other functions, one of which is building muscles, but there could be lots of different things that protein is useful for. And adequate carbohydrates are also needed for testosterone production. And so again, this can help with muscle production, but can also help with lots of other things that testosterone is useful for in the body. I talked about earlier with carbohydrates that some of it is converted into glycogen. And we can then call on that glycogen later under times of stress, between meals. Our body, though, has a limited supply of glycogen, or a limited amount that it can store. And so you may have heard of marathon runners referring to hitting the wall, or for cyclists, the term or phrase is bonking. And so they suddenly feel extreme fatigue and this decrease in performance. And this is happening because the glycogen stores have now become depleted. And so the weakening of muscle sets in, and the reason for this is it takes longer to transform the chemical energy in fatty acids and protein into usable energy in comparison to glucose. And after prolonged exercise, with the glycogen gone, the muscles now have to rely on these other fuel sources. And because of the intensity of the exercise, these fuel sources just aren't as good as carbohydrates or glucose was. And outside of intense endurance exercise, like having adequate glycogen storage is also important. So lots of the clients who I work with have many health issues going on. And one of the reasons for this is that they have poor glycogen storage. And it means that they have barely any reserves. So when they run out of a meal or when life becomes more stressful again, they just don't have much to fall back on. And this isn't a good place to be in on day after day. And while it's often portrayed that glycogen storage happens very easily, like this isn't the case. Now, obviously, if inadequate amounts of carbohydrates or inadequate amounts of calories are coming in, then this is going to prevent glycogen storage. Like in this case, there's not enough coming in to meet the current demands. So the thought of storing anything extra just isn't a priority because it needs to be used up now. And this can happen regardless of how much someone weighs. Like this kind of scenario isn't just restricted to those who look visibly thin or visibly malnourished. It can happen all along the weight spectrum. It just depends on what is the energy intake versus what is the energy outtake that someone is using. High insulin actually prevents proper glycogen storage. So having insulin go up with a meal and then back down, this is not a problem. Like this is what should be happening. The issue is for people who constantly have high insulin levels, like in insulin insensitivity issues, so insulin resistance, syndrome X, diabetes. Glycogen storage is also prevented if there are high stress hormones, so things like adrenaline and cortisol. And these are the hormones that normally pull glycogen stores back out of the liver and out of the muscles to be used for energy. So if someone's stress hormones are chronically high, it's going to prevent glycogen from being stored in the first place. So if the opposite is true, like if someone is having adequate amounts of carbohydrates and there's good glycogen storage, it increases their ability to train intensely. It increases their ability to do endurance. But it's not just about training. Like it's also about being able to live well. So many of my clients like work long days in very mentally demanding jobs, and this requires decent amounts of carbohydrates to make this work. You don't just use calories and you don't just use carbohydrates when being physical. Like you can use huge amounts for brain power through thinking. So it's estimated that the brain uses roughly 20% of the calories that you consume. And considering how small the brain is in terms of overall weight in comparison to the amount of body, for a very small region, it's using a very large amount of energy. And because the brain's preference is for glucose at its energy source, this makes carbohydrates really important for this role. And so I've often made reference to this bit of research from one of my favorite science writers called Robert Sapolsky, from one of my favorite books, Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. So let me just quote what he had to say. You have two humans and they are taking part in some human ritual. They are sitting there silently at a table. They make no eye contact, they're still, except every now and then one of them does nothing more taxing than lifting an arm and pushing a little piece of wood. And if it's the right wood and the right grand chess masters in the middle of a tournament, they are going through 6,000 and 7,000 calories a day thinking, turning on a massive psychological stress response simply with thought and doing the same thing with their bodies as if they were some baboon who has just ripped open the stomach of their worst rival, and it's all with thought and memories and emotions. So while your day-to-day job might not be as mentally taxing as a chess grandmaster, in the middle of a tournament, like thinking that I only need to eat a small amount of food today or only need to eat a small amount of carbohydrates today because I didn't exercise isn't the right way to think about it. And this is especially true when part of the reason that no exercise happened was because you're working a 10 or 12-hour day in some mentally and emotionally intensive work. So that's it in terms of carbohydrate functions in the body. You may be wondering why I haven't talked about insulin so far in this episode. I'm actually not going to talk about insulin in this podcast. It's a huge topic all on its own. I did tackle it in one of my first episodes, episode 3, called Understanding Blood Sugar. But rather than suggest you listen to that one, please wait until I release episode 2 because there's quite a bit of updating that I want to do. So let's now look at the different types of carbohydrates. So carbohydrates can be split into two categories. You've got simple carbohydrates and you've got complex carbohydrates. And while on the surface this may seem like an easy dichotomy, it's not so straightforward. And the advice that is often given, that you want to avoid simple carbohydrates and eat more complex carbohydrates, is also more nuanced than it's made out. So simple carbohydrates contain short, like single and double sugar chains. So the monosaccharides and the disaccharides that I talked about earlier on. And this means they are much more easily absorbed and enter into the bloodstream quicker. When most people hear the word simple carbohydrates, they think of things like table sugar or confectionery or soft drinks or cakes or biscuits, white bread, white pasta. And typically simple carbohydrates is shorthand for processed foods or processed carbs. But interestingly, something like white bread or white pasta, despite its refining process, would actually be considered a complex carbohydrate. And this is because the sugars are still mostly in the polysaccharide or starch form. Now, these foods do digest quickly, but this is more because the fiber has been removed rather than them being simple sugars. If we're thinking of whole foods, fruit is the most common natural form of simple carbohydrates. This would include like whole fruits, but would also include fruit juices, also include dried fruits. Milk would be another simple carbohydrate, although it contains protein and fats. Natural sugars like honey and maple syrup and blackstrap molasses and coconut sugar also fall into this category. In terms of complex carbohydrates, these include the foods that contain oligosaccharides and polysaccharides. So these are the longer chains of sugars that are part of starches or are the cellulose or other fiber components of plants that give it its structure. And to be used as energy, these long chains of sugars need to be broken down to single sugars. And so they typically digest more slowly and provide the body with a steadier source of energy. This isn't always the case, as I've just mentioned with white bread, but in a general sense, complex carbohydrates digest more slowly than simple carbohydrates. Foods that fall into the complex carbohydrates groups are root vegetables, are whole grains, are legumes, and also above ground vegetables. And I will go through each of these. So given the two different categories, like what are the best sources of carbohydrates? So what should you be eating? This is actually a section that I've given quite a bit of an overhaul to. And there's a number of reasons for this. Like one is that 3 years ago, I was much more prescriptive with clients than I am now. And while I was helping them listen to their body, I was more quick to jump in and to offer my advice. And connected to this was like at the time, I was fairly heavily influenced by the work of Ray Peat and people who advocated his work, so like Josh and Jeannie Rubin and Danny Roddy. And with time, I've softened my support of many of these views and actually disagree with others of them. And thirdly, I've started working more and more with people at further extremes on the disordered eating and eating disorder spectrum. And this has firmly showed me the importance of context. And it's not like I didn't know that context mattered when talking about this stuff before, but it's just been really drilled home to the point that I'm just more open in my approach, I'm more client-centered in my perspective, and I think my recommendations as part of this podcast should take that into consideration. So what I want to do is talk about what I found to be the carbohydrates that work best for the majority of people. And when I say work best, I'm talking from both a digestive perspective, but also in terms of providing energy and nutrients. But I want to add some caveats to this. Like one is that these initial recommendations are looking at the bell curve of what works for most people. There are going to be exceptions. Secondly, there's also going to be a massive factor of where someone is at with their relationship with food. So even if these foods are better on paper, if this feels like dieting, if this feels like restricting, then this is not where we start, or it might not even be where we end. So I do think someone's relationship with food is something that really has to be taken into consideration, irrespective of how amazing something may appear on paper or how much research there is to back something up. And then thirdly, it depends on where someone's health is at and why they are seeing me that will dictate what carbohydrates may be more appropriate for them. So for example, if someone's coming from the place of a restrictive diet, then calories are going to trump everything else. In which case, the easy way of doing this could be having them have more of what people think of as processed foods or processed carbs. And while these foods can often be talked about as health damaging, in many situations they can be incredibly health promoting and is what someone needs to help them improve in that context. So with that in mind, like this first section is probably most about what appears to be the best on paper and for someone who is relatively healthy in terms of their relationship with food. And so for this section of the population, one of the kinds of carbohydrates that tend to do well is root vegetables. So this would include the carrots, celeriac, sweet potatoes, yams, parsnips, all the different types of squashes, pumpkins, beetroot, turnips. I've probably missed some. When root vegetables are cooked well, they're easy to digest. And many of them, so potatoes and sweet potatoes, for example, have high amounts of carbohydrate, which is great for energy, but are also very satiating. Fruit would be the next category. And I know that fruit can often get a bashing in the low-carb world because it is a simple sugar or a simple carbohydrate. And so people are often told that if they're going to have fruit, they need to go for the low-sugar fruits like berries. Well, I'd say that this recommendation really isn't supported by the evidence. Like eating fruit is associated with better health, and this is probably because of a combination of the sugars, so the glucose and the fructose, the fiber it provides, the vitamins, the minerals, and the various phytochemicals like polyphenols that it includes. It does feel strange to think in this day and age that people fear fruit and think of it as unhealthy, but for a lot of people, that is where they're at. And I just say that the evidence doesn't support this idea. Alongside fruit and root vegetables, then you have like the grain starches. So things like oats and millet, quinoa, rice, couscous, spelt, amaranth, wheat, barley, buckwheat, bulgur wheat, and then all the different breads and pastas and foodstuffs that are made from these. I've probably missed other grains, but you get the idea. There's a couple of things I should mention with these. So one is that just because something is refined doesn't necessarily make it a bad thing. And in fact, in some cases, it can be helpful. So as an example, let me use white rice versus brown rice. Often with the clients I see, I'll typically recommend that they eat white rice instead of brown rice. And so why would I do this? Brown rice does have a higher nutrient content, but this is in the bran layer on the outside of the rice. This means it can be difficult to digest, and that I find that brown rice is less well tolerated and digested for many of my clients. And obviously, this is an individual thing, but in the beginning, when someone's starting to improve their health, digestion can be impaired, and this is just what I notice with the people I see. And I just say, like, just because a nutrient is in a food doesn't mean that you absorb it when you eat it. You only get out of it what you can actually digest. And people focus so much on how many vitamins a food has in it with little regard for how well are they actually digesting it. I think kale is probably the perfect example of this. Kale, gram for gram, probably has more nutrients in it than any other food. The problem is kale is incredibly difficult for the body to digest. Like, we are not ruminant animals and don't possess the capability to break down cellulose very well, which kale is incredibly high in. And so while it may be full of nutrients, our ability to get them out can be limited. And if someone's digestion is compromised, this is going to be even worse for them. And so the same is true when looking at brown rice versus white rice, or white pasta versus whole wheat pasta. I would say the same thing with other grains, like quinoa, for example, has this real health halo around it. But when clients are eating it, I get them to pay attention to how well are they digesting it. Are they seeing it in their stool? How does it leave them feeling? And this is true for all carbohydrates and for all foods. But I often find that certain grains often need more attention because people are so easily swayed by the potential health benefits of eating quinoa or eating whole grains or eating brown rice that they don't pay attention to how it actually leaves them feeling. And I don't want to create grain phobia, like it's not what I'm trying to do, but I would say it's not uncommon for clients to get gas and bloating and loose stools and digestive aches and pains, and that this improves when their consumption goes down. And most of these people seem to have a threshold with it. So if they have 2 or 3 or 4 times a week, it's not a problem and they're symptom free. But as soon as they're starting to have it every day or a couple of times a day, this is when they start to get symptoms. And I'd actually put myself in this category. So I have toast with my breakfast probably 4 or 5 days a week. I'll occasionally have some pasta for dinner. I'll have some couscous or quinoa for lunch sometimes, but that's kind of it. And I've noticed if I up my grain intake more than this, then my digestion just isn't great. And I just tend to do better on other carbohydrates, so things like potatoes and sweet potatoes. I do eat a lot of rice, and mostly this is white rice. But for me, this seems to be fine, and my digestion, my energy is fine with this. So I kind of think of white rice separately to the other grains for myself, but that's not necessarily the case for other people. But I also want to add the opposite of this, that I definitely have clients at the other end of the spectrum where they do incredibly well with bread and pasta, and this is one of the carbohydrates that they want to be including multiple times a day because it really works for them. And so I'm not anti these foods. I'm just trying to give an insight of something that I've noticed in practice. Another category of carbohydrates is legumes, which includes beans and lentils. I didn't actually talk about this in the last podcast, in the first edition, probably because I wasn't recommending them much because of the influence of people like Ray Peat, and also because they have decent amounts of protein in them. So I left it for the episode that I did on understanding protein instead. But in this second edition, I want to include it, and I'd say that legumes can be a great source of carbohydrates. And the caveat with all this is, again, to pay attention to digestion. Like, these are foods that some clients will notice lead to increased gas and bloating and digestive discomfort, and can have an impact on their stools. Sometimes this can be remedied by soaking the legumes first before cooking them, or cooking them for a much longer time. So making a dal from lentils and cooking it on the stove for an hour or 2 hours instead of the 20 or 30 minutes that is recommended on the packet. Or it could be a matter of figuring out which legumes like you tolerate better, and which are an issue. So some clients find that, okay, I'm fine with black beans and I'm fine with kidney beans, but if I'm having chickpeas, that's when it's an issue. Above ground vegetables are then another source of carbohydrates, and this includes things like cucumber, cauliflower, cabbage, courgette, celery, broccoli, peppers, mushrooms, aubergine, asparagus, Brussels sprouts, broad beans, kale, and all the different types of green leafy vegetables and salads, tomato, corn, peas, green beans. There's probably others. Above ground vegetables are typically low in calories and also lower in carbohydrates. Obviously, there are exceptions to this, corn probably being one of them. They're also potentially tougher on digestion than other forms I've already mentioned due to the higher fiber content. And this means that the return on investment for the calories used to digest them versus the calories you get out of them is much smaller. And calories aren't the only benefit you get from a food, and it's not the only reason you eat, but it is worth keeping in mind. And so I'd suggest that if you are having above ground vegetables with a meal, then you also want to have some other form of carbohydrate and one of the other kind of more denser forms that I've talked about already alongside them. My other suggestion with the above ground vegetables, and again, this is context specific for the kinds of clients that I see who often have weaker digestion, who are often coming from a place of under eating for what their body needs, is that if they are having the above ground vegetables, to really cook them well. Like the tendency is for them to be lightly steamed or for them to be eating them raw. And so with these clients, they're getting lots of bloating and gas and pain and discomfort. And then when I look at what they're eating, there's like a real predominancy of salads and lightly steamed vegetables. So to help with those symptoms, vegetables can be cooked really well, or they can be used in a soup, which typically, again, entails a longer cooking time. And yes, this cooking process will lower the vitamin and mineral content, but it will also mean that you can digest them. And as I mentioned before, food is only as good as you can digest it. And obviously, if you eat these foods lightly steamed or raw and you have no adverse reactions to them, then just keep what you're doing. But I'm just mentioning it for someone where this isn't the case. So what about refined carbohydrates? So the kind of foods people think of when they hear processed carbs. Like really, if there is any one villain that is blamed for our health woes at the moment, sugar would be that villain. Like fat was blamed for our poor health in the 80s and 90s. Really, sugar has taken the crown. And do I believe that this blame is warranted? Not really. Like, honestly, I don't think there is any one single food that is to blame for our health problems. Like, health is an incredibly complex thing that has many, many, many different factors. And this is where I do think people go wrong. Like, they try and think about food in black and white terms and health in very simplistic black and white terms and just don't bring in context to the thinking. And I just don't think that sugar or chocolate or refined foods are inherently bad. It's how they are used and the body they're going into. And there is an idea I remember from economics at school called opportunity cost. And in simple terms, an opportunity cost is the cost of picking one alternative versus any other option. So as an example, you decide to have a chocolate bar in the afternoon as your afternoon snack. This is the only food you have between lunch and dinner. The opportunity cost of this is all of the alternatives that you could have chosen in its place. So by choosing only the chocolate bar, you're missing out on taking in any real protein with this meal. You're missing out on taking in any real fruits or vegetables or fiber. You're missing out on basically just all the other foods that you could have had instead. Now, let's say instead of just having a chocolate bar in the afternoon, you had a mandarin, a piece of cheese, and a chocolate bar. In this instance, you're taking in a more substantial snack. It now contains some protein in the form of the cheese, which was missing from the chocolate bar on its own. There is fruit, and there's the extra fiber and the nutrients that you then get from it. There's still obviously an opportunity cost with all the other potential foods you missed out on, but for many clients, they'll feel better having this snack than just the chocolate bar on its own. And this isn't because the chocolate bar is inherently bad, but because of all the other foods that didn't come in because of this food choice. And there's something new that I'm adding to this addition in that I remember many years ago being enamored by the work of Dr. Weston A. Price and the recommendations of people like Sally Fallon and the Weston A. Price Foundation. I've now updated many of these beliefs around this stuff, but there are some ideas that have stuck. Price studied populations in the early 1920s and 30s, and he'd go to these remote areas and look at how changes to food intake was affecting health, particularly to do with like dental health, but health in general. And what he found was that health would start to get worse when these tribes or cultures or areas were introduced to modern foods. And modern foods like white flour and white sugar and refined oils. And I will add that this was at a time before we really knew very much about vitamins and minerals. So today with white flour, it will be fortified, it will have vitamins and minerals that it's added to. But back then we didn't know to do this. We just didn't understand what was being lost as part of this refining process. But the reason I'm mentioning this is because of the term that Price used to describe these foods, and he called them displacing foods of modern commerce. And the important word here is displacing, because it is the same as my idea around opportunity costs. While people talk about sugar or processed food as being toxic, this isn't the case. If these kinds of foods are causing a problem for someone, it's because they are being eaten in isolation or because they are displacing other foods that could be helpful for that individual. So missing out on these other foods is the major problem rather than the inherently bad or damaging nature of chocolate or cookies or cake. So if these foods are included as part of a healthy diet and is eaten in that context, then it's not going to cause a problem. And there is now going to be a lot of debate about what the words healthy diet means and how this should be defined. But the point I'm trying to make is that these foods aren't inherently a problem in the way that they are typically made out. Now, can someone be having negative health problems that are caused by eating too many refined carbohydrates? Yes, of course they can. But this is typically because of a lack of other foods that are missing. And again, I do want to mention that context matters, because for many clients, especially those recovering from an eating disorder or disordered eating, eating these kinds of processed foods or processed carbs can be incredibly helpful. Helpful because it allows them to get in the calories that they need in an easy to digest manner, and helpful in that it breaks down fears and anxieties around food. Because it's one thing to not eat chocolate because you don't really like the taste of it. It's another thing to not eat it because you're deathly afraid of it, but then have this overwhelming craving for it and then feel guilty anytime that you do eat it. There are now other forms of carbohydrates that I haven't mentioned yet. So things like fruit juices or all the various forms of sugars, so like the maple syrups and the honey and the blackstrap molasses, etc. Really, I don't have a strong opinion on them. Like if you consume them and you do well on them, then keep them up. If you don't do well on them, then don't consume them. And I kind of say the same for any other form that I've inadvertently missed. So the final area that I want to mention is the concept of carbohydrate longevity. And this is another section that I did talk about in the first edition that's getting a rather large overhaul. And it's for the same reasons I mentioned when talking about my changes to food recommendations. So you have 10 different forms. Like for example, you can have 10 different foods that have the exact same amount of carbohydrates in them. And they have even the same amount of calories. But people will do better from an energy perspective on one form or on some forms better than they will on others. And what I'm wanting to suggest to you is that you pay attention to this and see if you can figure out which are the best ones for you. And so what do I mean by carbohydrate longevity? I mean the amount of time that a food or a meal is able to keep you going. Now, obviously, there are many considerations that come into play when someone decides what they want to eat. And so it's not like just how long something sustains you is going to be the only reason. But what I'm suggesting is that it should be at least a reason. And it is something that you can figure out by paying attention to what happens when you eat certain foods. And just as an aside, and again, this is new to this episode, is that one of the areas I'm regularly working on with clients is identifying hunger symptoms. And what I found is that for most people, being hungry for them equals a growling stomach or specific hunger feeling in the stomach abdominal region. But actually, a lot of the time, these kinds of sensations happen much later on. And in fact, there are other symptoms that can alert clients to the fact that they're becoming hungrier or they're getting sort of lower energy that they can start to notice. So I just want to run through a rather non-exhaustive list of symptoms that can be connected to hunger, just so this can be kept in mind when thinking about this idea of longevity. So the first symptom is like feeling of emptiness in your stomach. You've got gurgling or rumbling or growling in the stomach, dizziness, faintness or lightheadedness, headache, fatigue, so like weak or tired or shaky feeling, daytime sleepiness, irritability or easily agitated, lack of concentration, indecisiveness, nausea or car sickness feeling, acid reflux, increased thirst or dry mouth, frequent urination, especially if it's clear, cold hands or feet or tip of the nose, blurred vision or straining eyes or vision changes, anxiety, nervousness, palpitations, low mood. So these are all symptoms that you can be looking out for. There may be others that you notice once you start to pay attention. But the reason I'm saying this is just trying to listen out for or notice a growling stomach as being the time at which you should eat, I think is overly simplistic. So then with this in mind, like when you eat a potato, when you eat some pasta, when you eat a piece of toast or a fruit salad, pay attention to how long that food or that meal keeps you going. Like what do you start to notice? Do you notice that having some fruit keeps you going for an hour and a half, whereas the pasta keeps you going for 2 hours? And if so, when deciding what to eat, this information can be taken into consideration. And that's not to say that you just go with the food that keep you going the longer. So in this example, you'd always skip over the fruit and you'd always go with the pasta. But it's about, okay, what is the rest of my day looking like after this meal? What have I got on this afternoon? What are the demands? When's the next time I'm going to get a chance to eat after this? Because that can then influence what would be a helpful food to be eating at this moment. There are some ideas that I would just add to this. So one is that calories matter. So the reason one meal may give longevity over another may simply be that it is a bigger meal. Another could be less about the carbohydrates, but instead other macronutrients. So you could have some potatoes with lots of butter on them, and then you could have some potatoes with tuna on them, and these have the exact same amount of calories. But what you find is you do better with the potato with tuna on it because it provides you with protein, and that protein helps with the longevity. Another idea is just to remind you to pay attention to you rather than what people tell you should happen. And I think like porridge or oatmeal is a great example of this. So on paper, porridge, oatmeal is talked about as this very healthy breakfast option. And for about half of the people I see, I would agree with this. Like if they have the porridge or the oatmeal for breakfast, it keeps them warm, it keeps them energized, it keeps them full for hours. But it really is one of the best things that they can have in the morning. But then for the other half of people, and I'd put myself in this category, they do terribly on it. So for me, like within an hour, I will be hungry, I will be cold, I will be peeing rather frequently. Like I don't care how healthy you tell me that porridge is, I very rarely eat it for breakfast because it's just not a great option for me. And so I would say this is true for other foods as well. So irrespective of how healthy someone tells you something is, and I would say the opposite is also true, irrespective of how unhealthy someone tells you something is, if it is working for you, then keep doing that thing. If someone is coming from an intentional low-carb diet, or they've just been eating small amounts or avoiding foods like root vegetables or rice because they thought they were unhealthy, the results when paying attention to this stuff in the short term could be a little different to what's going to happen in the long term. And this can be true as well of someone who's just been keeping their calories really low. So for someone in this scenario, they may have, I don't know, like a jacket potato for lunch, And rather than it making them feel energized or giving them good, stable energy for the next couple of hours, it just makes them want to go to sleep. And what I found is typically this is a short-term thing. And as they continue to bring carbohydrates back into their diet, and they do this regularly, as they continue to increase their calories, they get to a point where this switches. And then they no longer feel sleepy from these foods, but they have good, long, consistent energy after eating them. So it might take a little longer to figure this out than just what happens on that one occasion. This can also be impacted on by poor sleep. So without someone being on a low-carb diet. If you've slept poorly, then having a high-carbohydrate meal, especially one high in starch, so like potatoes or pasta, could lead to you feeling rather sleepy afterwards. You then fast forward 2 days, 3 days where you've slept really well, you have this exact same meal and you feel really good after it. So I just wanted to point out that sleep can interfere or change the feedback that you get. Carbohydrate longevity is also important with eating disorder recovery and with a lot of the clients who work within this area. So I know I mentioned earlier on about how useful more refined foods can be as a way of getting in calories. Well, this can be less helpful if those foods don't lead to a client feeling satiated and if they're like hungry 20 minutes later. So for example, with clients, they'll often start eating lots of toast in recovery. It's a food that they feared for a long time or they simply have restricted for a long time. And so they enjoy being able to eat it again. But what I've noticed many times over is that clients can get to a point where almost irrespective of how many pieces of toast they eat, they just don't get full. Or they're full, but just not for very long. And so the solution here isn't to tell these clients that they should stop having toast, but instead to see if they can add something in that is going to give them the calories that they need, but also leads to filling them up more. The final thing I want to mention before I wrap this up relates to the liquid content of carbohydrates and a carbohydrate meal, as this can affect people differently. So something like a smoothie could be high in calories, could be high in carbohydrates, but because of the high liquid content, it may not work so well for someone. And part of this can be linking into the time of day. So I know personally, and this is the same with lots of clients, high water content carbs or juices or smoothies just aren't great first thing in the morning. So it doesn't matter how much carbohydrates or how many calories are in them. Within the short space of time, my energy is low, I'm feeling cold, I'm urinating frequently, I'm hungry. If I then have that food in the afternoon, it's a completely different thing. Like I feel better, it works really well, so I can have a smoothie or I can have some orange juice at that point and it's fine with me. So I just want to mention about paying attention to the water content of the food and if at different points this has an impact on the longevity and how well you tolerate it. I really suggest just paying attention to this stuff. Like what forms do you do better with? What snacks and meals leave you feeling satisfied and satiated? So that is it for the show. And it was at this point when I recorded the original show that I made reference to the book, The Low Carb Myth by Ari Whitten. So it covers everything you've ever wanted to know about carbohydrates and insulin and diabetes and basically any topic related to carbohydrate intake and health. It's much more detailed and thorough and research focused than this episode. And while I think, and I still think it is a great book, given the kinds of clients I work with has shifted over these years, as well as the themes that I talk about on this podcast, I'm giving it more of a tentative recommendation. So if you can read a book about health and nutrition and not have it send you down a spiral, and you're the kind of person who really likes to nerd out on the science, then give it a read. Otherwise, I would suggest just giving it a miss. So as I said, that is it for this week. Next week's episode is with another guest. It is already recorded. It's a great conversation, so I'm looking forward to bringing it to you. That is it. Have a great week, and I will catch you soon.
Thanks for listening to Real Health Radio. If you are interested in more details, you can find them at the 7 Health website. That's www.7health.com.